Well, two members of Jacksonville's city council were suspended last week, indicted on fraud charges, and leaving the city council with two empty seats. The legal trouble facing Katrina Brown and Reggie Brown could sideline several pieces of legislation to help communities in the city. First Coast News reporter Julia Janae joins us live from City Hall tonight. So, Julia, let's talk about what happens to the bills that both of the Browns were working on.
Well, Anthony, what we saw today was a bill being deferred. The goal of that proposed legislation was to give protections to the city's homeless, and the council members voted or agreed that they would defer that bill because the bill's sponsor, Katrina Brown, was not present today to comment. It's one of several bills that both Katrina Brown and Reginald Brown were working on at the time of that grand jury indictment announcement. With two council members absent for the foreseeable future, it raises questions of what happens to their work in progress now that Reginald Brown and Katrina Brown are facing charges, dozens of counts of fraud handed up by a grand jury last week.
So we're going to defer 2018-308.
At a meeting today, a proposed homeless bill of rights introduced by Katrina was tabled, leaving advocates concerned it's the community that suffers.
I think that's a very important bill.
Adjuan Whitfield of Friends of Hemming Park said the delay could affect the homeless they help every day.
One thing that I always have an issue with is how politics affect people, and this is a sure case of it.
Also pending in City Hall, a zoning bill introduced by Katrina and Reginald in February. It would monitor the number of liquor stores in a certain area and give neighbors the power to restrict additional store openings. Katrina is also the sole sponsor of a Fight the Blight bill that asks for $100,000 for a campaign to deter littering. And just last month, Reginald introduced a bill to install a JEA water line on Citra Avenue in Northwest Jacksonville, also pending in committee. City Council President Anna Brochet says she, along with Councilman Samuel Newby, will be handling the needs of the people in Districts 8 and 10, but said she doesn't plan to pick up any of the now suspended leaders' legislation unless it relates directly to the district.
If she's suspended and all the legislation that she had is now null and void, I think that there should be another city council member that picks up those bills that are important, especially that Bill of Rights for the homeless.
That it's possible that other council members could pick up that legislation. The new vacancies, or the new people who will be selected to fill those vacancies, could be coming in the next several weeks. For now, reporting live downtown, Julia Janae, First Coast News, on your side.